Welcome to History in Ashes. Here we cover everything about history, the victories, the defeats, the forgotten moments in between. And today, you and I begin a long journey through the complete history of Napoleon Bonaparte. Let us start with something that may surprise you. Did you know Napoleon was not born in France, but on a Mediterranean island called Corsica, a place that had only recently been conquered by the French when he was born in 1769? Imagine this. The man who would one day become Emperor of the French began life not even truly French in the eyes of many. Another curious fact. He was not a tall man, as myths have painted him, but closer to average height, standing a little over 5.5 feet. Yet his enemies painted him as short to belittle him, and centuries later, we still remember the insult more than the reality. Perhaps most striking of all, his rise from obscurity to emperor came during a time when thousands of noblemen were losing their heads under the guillotine. He climbed upward, not because he was born into privilege, but because the chaos of revolution left cracks in which a man like him could grow. Before we go further, let me ask you something. Could you kindly pause for a moment, go to the comments section, and let us know where you are watching this from and what time it is there? I always find it fascinating to see how history gathers people from every corner of the world at all hours of the day. And while you are down there, do me a favor. Subscribe to the channel. If Napoleon had a YouTube channel, I imagine he would demand your subscription by decree, but here I can only ask politely. Still, he might remind you that no empire, and certainly no channel, can survive without support. Now, let us step into his world. Corsica, in the late 18th century, was a land caught between identities. Once under Genoese control, it had been sold to France in the years before Napoleon's birth. The people there spoke a dialect closer to Italian than French, and loyalty was not easily transferred to Paris. Napoleon's father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer who navigated this difficult transition, serving as a representative of Corsican interests to the French court. His mother, Letizia, was known for her stern discipline and resilience, qualities she would pass on to her son. Napoleon himself grew up with a sense of being an outsider, not quite French, not fully Corsican. This feeling of in-betweenness shaped his early ambitions. He wanted acceptance, but more than that, he wanted mastery. As a boy, he was sent to mainland France for education. Imagine him, a Corsican with a heavy accent, mocked by his peers for his rough manners and awkward speech. He did not blend easily into the polished world of French aristocratic children. But where others laughed, he buried himself in study. Mathematics, artillery, and the writings of Enlightenment thinkers became his refuge. He read Rousseau's vision of equality, Plutarch's stories of great generals, and the dry, detailed texts on military engineering that most students would have found intolerable. These were the seeds of his future. In those school days, Napoleon learned a truth that would serve him well for life. Power was not given, it was taken. And it was not always seized in dramatic moments of glory, but often in the quiet, grinding persistence of outworking others. He may have been laughed at by the sons of noble families, but he outshone them in examinations, in strategy games, in military exercises. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, Napoleon was still a young man, a lieutenant with few connections. But revolutions are storms, and in storms, strange things rise to the surface. The revolution tore down centuries of hierarchy, leaving opportunities for those with talent and daring. Napoleon, with his training and relentless energy, was ready to seize them. His chance came during the siege of Toulon in 1793, where he demonstrated a brilliance with artillery that turned the tide for the revolutionary forces. In one decisive moment, the quiet, mocked Corsican boy began to step into the center of history. But think of the ordinary lives around him, the soldiers marching on empty stomachs, the families fleeing cities in terror, the thousands of voices that cheered or cursed as new governments rose and fell almost monthly. Napoleon's rise was not only his own doing, it was carved out of the instability and desperation of an entire nation searching for order. Here is a thought to leave you with. Was Napoleon a genius who bent history to his will, or was he merely carried forward by the waves of revolution, lifted higher because he happened to stand in the right place at the right time? The French Revolution was not just a political upheaval, it was a collapse of certainty. Imagine a society where centuries of monarchy, religion, and class hierarchy had dictated every rule of life. Now all of it had been torn apart, and in its place stood chaos, mobs in the streets, bread shortages, and the constant threat of violence. For a young officer like Napoleon Bonaparte, this was both a dangerous and an extraordinary time. The revolution created opportunities, but also deadly risks. One misstep, one poorly chosen alliance, and you might find yourself condemned as a traitor. In those years, the guillotine never rested, its blade falling day after day in Paris, sending nobles, priests, and even revolutionaries themselves into oblivion. For Napoleon, survival depended not only on skill, but also on a careful reading of the winds of politics. He had to know when to step forward, when to hold back, and which men to follow as the revolutionary government shifted constantly between factions. His first real chance came at Toulon in 1793. The port city, crucial for its naval base, had risen against the revolution and invited the British fleet to occupy it. The situation was disastrous for the young French Republic. If Toulon remained in enemy hands, France would lose its foothold in the Mediterranean. Napoleon, then a mere artillery captain, proposed a bold plan. He recognized that by seizing a key hill overlooking the harbour, French artillery could drive the British fleet away. It was a technical detail, something that required precise calculations of distance, trajectory, and supply of munitions, the sort of detail most commanders overlooked. Yet Napoleon saw significance in the small things, the boring but decisive calculations. When his plan was executed, the French recaptured Toulon. In the reports that followed, Napoleon's name appeared not as a junior officer, but as the architect of victory. From that moment, his rise quickened. Still, one must imagine what this meant for those under his command. Soldiers in the artillery worked long hours, hauling heavy cannons across muddy fields, sweating and freezing, often without proper food. Many were boys barely out of adolescence, pulled into the Revolutionary Army by circumstance. They carried not only weapons, but the uncertainty of whether their sacrifice would be remembered or forgotten. For them, Napoleon was not yet a legend, only a stern commander who demanded much, but delivered victories that kept them alive. By 1795, Paris itself was unstable. Royalists attempted an uprising against the revolutionary government known as the Directory. Napoleon, now seen as a reliable officer, was called upon to defend the city. With ruthless efficiency, he ordered artillery to fire grape shot into the crowds, a moment remembered as the whiff of grape shot. Hundreds fell, and the uprising ended. It was brutal, and for some, it revealed a coldness in his character, a willingness to sacrifice lives for stability. But to the Directory, it proved he was a man who could be trusted to restore order. That single decision propelled him into command of the army of Italy. Italy was not yet a unified country, but a collection of states and kingdoms, many influenced by Austria. The French government sent Napoleon there not expecting greatness, but because resources were limited. The army was poorly equipped, half-starved, and demoralized. Some commanders might have seen this as a burden, but Napoleon saw an opening. He knew that soldiers did not fight only for pay or rations. They fought for belief, for the sense that their suffering had meaning. Upon taking command, he delivered a speech promising them honor, glory, and riches if they followed him. He appealed not to their empty stomachs, but to their hunger for purpose, and remarkably, it worked. The ragged army marched with renewed vigor, and through a series of rapid maneuvers, Napoleon defeated much larger Austrian forces, forcing them back again and again. His style was different from the old generals. Instead of moving slowly with supply trains, he drove his army to live off the land, marching faster, striking harder, and confusing his enemies with unexpected movements. Battles were won not only by force but by the exhaustion of his opponents, who never knew where he would strike next. Yet this strategy came at a human cost. Villages were stripped of food, civilians bore the burden of occupation, and soldiers themselves marched until their feet bled. Victory was never clean. Still, to the people of France, the victories in Italy were a revelation. Here was a young general, barely in his late 20s, defeating the powerful Austrian Empire and bringing home treaties that expanded French influence. He returned to Paris a hero, celebrated not only for his military skill, but for his ability to capture the imagination of the public. Newspapers carried exaggerated accounts of his triumphs, and artists painted him as a man chosen by destiny. But what did this mean for ordinary Parisians? Bread remained scarce, the economy fragile, and daily life uncertain. While Napoleon's victories brought glory, they did not always bring stability to the streets of Paris. People still lined up for food, still feared the knock at the door from revolutionary officials, still wondered if tomorrow would bring relief or more suffering. Napoleon's story, from the beginning, was never separate from theirs. His rise was tied to the hopes of millions who wanted a leader to give shape to the chaos. This brings us to a larger question. Was Napoleon's success in Italy proof of his genius, or was it simply the product of desperation, soldiers willing to follow anyone who gave them hope, and enemies unprepared for the recklessness of a man who had nothing to lose? After his victories in Italy, Napoleon was no longer just a general. He was a figure who commanded public attention in a way that few others could. In Paris, his name was spoken with admiration and curiosity. Pamphlets praised his victories, and caricatures painted him as a hero of destiny. Yet his success made the Directory, the fragile government of post-revolutionary France, uneasy. A man with too much popularity could quickly become a threat. To occupy him, and perhaps to keep him away from the politics of Paris, the Directory approved an ambitious campaign, an expedition to Egypt. On the surface, it was framed as a military mission to disrupt British trade routes to India, a bold move in the ongoing rivalry with Britain. But beneath that, it was something larger, an attempt to create a French presence in the East, to carve out an empire that might rival those of Alexander the Great. Napoleon, who had studied the classics endlessly, was drawn to the idea. Egypt was not just a battlefield, but a stage where a man could write himself into history. In 1798, the expedition set sail. Picture the sight: hundreds of ships carrying not only soldiers, but also scholars, scientists, artists, and engineers. This was no ordinary army. It was a strange mixture of muskets and telescopes, cannons and ancient manuscripts. For Napoleon, conquest and knowledge were intertwined. He wanted not only to win battles, but to uncover the secrets of civilization. The landing in Egypt was dramatic. The Battle of the Pyramids stands as one of the most memorable of his career. Against the Mamluk cavalry, fierce warriors famed for their skill, Napoleon arranged his men into massive squares of infantry, each bristling with bayonets and protected by artillery. The Mamluks charged again and again, but the French formations held firm, cutting them down with disciplined volleys of musket fire. As the battle raged near the shadow of the pyramids, Napoleon supposedly told his men, "Soldiers, 40 centuries look down upon you." Whether or not those words were truly spoken, they captured the essence of the moment. Napoleon was casting himself not just as a general of France, but as a figure standing in the line of history itself, heir to the legacies of pharaohs and conquerors. Yet Egypt was not as glorious as the victory suggested. Disease ravaged the French army, and the harsh climate wore them down. Supplies ran thin, and the people of Egypt did not easily accept foreign occupation. The daily lives of Napoleon's soldiers were filled with struggle. Long marches under the burning sun, dysentery spreading through camps, and fear of ambush in the narrow villages along the Nile. The Egyptian campaign was not only about battles, but about endurance in an environment far harsher than Europe. And then came disaster. At the Battle of the Nile, the French fleet was destroyed by Admiral Nelson of Britain. With their ships gone, Napoleon and his men were stranded, cut off from France. The grand dream of dominating the East suddenly seemed fragile, even foolish. Soldiers muttered, morale sank, and survival became uncertain. But here is where Napoleon's character revealed itself. Where others saw defeat, he turned to propaganda and reinvention. He directed scholars to record discoveries, leading to the famous Description de l'Égypte, a monumental work cataloguing the country's antiquities, culture, and natural world. Out of military failure, he created intellectual triumph. Even the discovery of the Rosetta Stone came from this expedition, a stone that would later unlock the ability to read ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. Still, as the months passed, Napoleon realized Egypt could not be held. In secrecy, leaving much of his army behind, he sailed back to France in 1799. It was a bold abandonment, but when he returned to Paris, he found the Directory collapsing under corruption, inefficiency, and lack of popular support. France was weary of instability, weary of leaders who could not deliver stability after years of revolution. Napoleon's timing was impeccable. He positioned himself not as a mere soldier, but as a savior of the nation. Using his connections and his growing reputation, he staged a coup in November of that year, seizing power and establishing the consulate. In the new government, he became first consul, in reality the ruler of France. What is striking is not only his ambition, but how ordinary people responded. Merchants in Paris longed for stable markets, farmers wanted consistent taxation, soldiers wanted reliable pay. Napoleon offered these things by promising order after years of chaos. It was not only his charisma, but the weariness of a nation that allowed him to take power. For the French, his rise was a bargain. They would accept one man's authority if it meant the end of endless uncertainty. But consider this: was his return from Egypt and seizure of power an act of genius or an act of opportunism? Did Napoleon truly save France, or did he merely exploit its exhaustion to crown himself its master? When Napoleon became first consul, France was not the mighty empire that later generations would remember. It was exhausted, battered by years of revolution and war, its people yearning for stability. In many ways, Napoleon's true genius was not only on the battlefield, but in his ability to restore order through reforms that touched nearly every aspect of life. He understood something fundamental. People might endure grand speeches and revolutionary ideals, but what they truly wanted was bread on the table, safety in the streets, and fairness in the law. Napoleon began by reorganizing the administration, introducing efficiency where corruption had run rampant. Taxes were standardized, collections made more consistent, and revenues finally began to flow in ways that allowed the state to function again. For the farmers and small traders, this meant fewer arbitrary demands, fewer bribes to petty officials, and a clearer sense of what they owed. Religion, too, was a source of tension. The revolution had stripped the Catholic Church of much of its power, alienating many ordinary people who had long relied on their faith for community and guidance. Napoleon saw that no government could survive if it stood permanently at war with the religion of the masses. In 1801, he signed the Concordat with the Pope, re-establishing the Church in France, but on terms that made it a partner of the state rather than a rival. Priests returned to their parishes, churches reopened, and faith once again had a place in public life. Yet Napoleon ensured that the church would remain subordinate to the government, a careful balance of spiritual comfort and political control. Perhaps his most enduring achievement, however, was the Napoleonic Code. Before Napoleon, French law was a confusing tangle of local customs, royal edicts, and revolutionary decrees. Justice depended on where you lived and who judged you. Napoleon's legal code simplified this chaos, creating a unified system based on principles of equality before the law, protection of property rights, and the secular authority of the state. Though it was not perfect, it reinforced patriarchal authority within families and limited women's independence. It provided clarity and stability. To this day, the Napoleonic Code influences legal systems across the world. But these reforms were not merely abstract policies. They shaped the daily rhythms of life. A farmer in Burgundy could plan his crops without fear of sudden arbitrary taxes. A merchant in Lyon could engage in trade knowing that contracts would be enforced under a consistent law. Even the schooling of children changed as Napoleon established a system of lycées, secondary schools designed to train administrators, officers, and citizens loyal to the state. For countless families, this meant that their sons, if not their daughters, could hope for advancement through education rather than noble birth. Meanwhile, Napoleon's personal power grew steadily. In 1802, he declared himself consul for life, a title that made clear his intent to hold control indefinitely. 2 years later, in a ceremony that stunned Europe, he crowned himself emperor in Notre Dame Cathedral. The symbolism was striking. The Pope was present, but Napoleon took the crown from his hands and placed it on his own head, declaring that his authority came not from the church, not from tradition, but from himself. It was both an audacious claim and a reflection of the truth. His rise had not been sanctioned by divine right, but forged in the chaos of revolution and war. Yet even as he reshaped France, Napoleon never lost sight of his military ambitions. Europe's monarchies looked upon him with suspicion, fearing that his revolutionary legitimacy and restless energy would spill beyond French borders. They were right. Wars with Austria, Prussia, and eventually Russia would follow, each reshaping the map of Europe. Still, within France, many accepted his rule gladly. After a decade of upheaval, stability felt like a blessing, even if it came at the price of freedom. People could sleep without fear of nightly arrests, markets bustled again, and families could begin to think of the future. Napoleon gave the French a sense of direction, and that, perhaps, was as valuable as his victories on the battlefield. But here lies a paradox worth considering. Was Napoleon truly a reformer who built a modern state, or was he simply preparing the foundation for his own empire of conquest? Did the people accept his changes out of hope for justice, or out of exhaustion, willing to trade liberty for stability? With the crown now upon his head, Napoleon faced a continent that refused to accept his authority. Kings and emperors across Europe saw him not as a legitimate sovereign, but as a revolutionary soldier who had crowned himself ruler. They formed coalitions to bring him down, convinced that France would not endure another great war after years of upheaval. Yet Napoleon thrived in conflict. To him, war was both a necessity and an opportunity, a means to secure his position at home and to expand his influence abroad. The early years of the Napoleonic Wars revealed his brilliance. In 1805, he launched a campaign against Austria and Russia, culminating in the Battle of Austerlitz. On a cold December morning, he faced two armies larger than his own. Yet he used deception with masterful skill, luring his opponents into attacking what they believed was his weak center. As the Allies surged forward, Napoleon struck at their flanks, splitting their forces and crushing them decisively. It became known as the Battle of the Three Emperors, and for Napoleon it was his masterpiece. Austria was forced to sign peace, Russia withdrew, and Europe trembled at his power. But these victories were not won without immense human cost. Soldiers marched for weeks with little rest, their boots worn through, their rations thin. Civilians in occupied territories watched armies strip their villages of food and supplies, unsure whether to fear the French more than their old rulers. War was not simply a clash of generals, it was a disruption of daily life for millions. Napoleon's victories were carved from the endurance of these men and women whose struggles rarely reached the history books. Before we press deeper into these wars, let me pause to say something to you directly. If you are still listening and have not subscribed to History in Ashes, now is the time. This channel depends entirely on your support. Without it, like Napoleon's empire, it cannot endure. If you do not subscribe, we may vanish from the field just as quickly as a defeated army. And trust me, unlike Napoleon, we do not have a reserve corps hidden somewhere to save us at the last moment. So do me, and history itself, a small favor and subscribe. Now let us return to the wars that would define an era. In 1806, Napoleon turned against Prussia, whose army had once been the envy of Europe. At Jena and Auerstedt, within the space of a single day, Napoleon shattered their forces. The disciplined Prussian military, steeped in tradition, collapsed before his rapid maneuvers and aggressive strikes. Cities fell quickly, and soon French troops marched into Berlin. To the ordinary citizens, it must have felt like the world had been turned upside down. The once proud kingdom brought low by the son of a Corsican lawyer. From Berlin, Napoleon issued the Continental System, a sweeping blockade designed to strangle Britain's economy by cutting off its trade with Europe. It was an ambitious idea. If Britain could not be beaten at sea, perhaps it could be starved through isolation. But the policy demanded obedience from every corner of Europe, and here Napoleon's vision began to strain against reality. Merchants resisted, smugglers thrived, and allied states bristled under the restrictions. For ordinary people, it meant shortages of goods, rising prices, and resentment that would simmer beneath the surface. Meanwhile, Napoleon pressed eastward. In 1807, he met the Russians at the bloody Battle of Eylau. Unlike Austerlitz, this was no brilliant triumph. It was a brutal, freezing clash fought in snow and mud, where tens of thousands fell without a clear victory. Soldiers lay dying in icy fields, civilians fled burning towns, and even Napoleon himself felt the weight of the losses. It was a reminder that even his genius could not always command nature or the stubborn endurance of his foes. Yet, by summer, he struck again, this time at Friedland, where he decisively defeated the Russians and forced Tsar Alexander into peace. The Treaty of Tilsit that followed was one of the high points of his career, marking a moment when Europe seemed to bend to his will. Napoleon and Alexander met dramatically on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, carving up Europe between them like two masters of fate. And yet, beneath the grandeur of treaties and battles, the lives of ordinary Europeans told another story. French soldiers were scattered across garrisons, longing for home but bound to distant frontiers. Peasants in Germany, Italy, and Poland paid heavy taxes to support the wars of a man they had never met. Merchants skirted the blockade in small boats, risking everything to move contraband goods. The empire was built not only on victories, but on the daily compromises and sufferings of countless unnamed people. Here lies the tension at the heart of Napoleon's reign. Could one man's victories justify the burdens placed upon millions? Was the order he imposed truly stability, or was it merely conquest wearing the mask of progress? For Napoleon, victory on the battlefield was never enough. He believed control had to extend into the daily lives of nations, into their economies, their politics, even their culture. The continental system was his grand strategy to weaken Britain, but enforcing it was another matter. Across Europe, merchants grumbled, ports fell silent, and markets dried up. Goods that once moved freely, sugar, coffee, cotton, spices, became scarce luxuries. Smuggling grew into a lifeline, carried out by small traders who risked prison or death to satisfy the demand for forbidden British goods. This was not the work of kings or generals, but of fishermen sneaking cargo across coasts at night, of widows selling contraband cloth in markets, of ordinary people who found ways to resist the empire quietly. Napoleon could win battles against armies, but against the hunger and ingenuity of common people, his decrees faltered. Spain became the most dangerous example of this resistance. In 1808, Napoleon attempted to enforce his will there by placing his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. On paper, it seemed logical, a reliable family member ruling a strategic kingdom. In reality, it sparked one of the most brutal conflicts of his reign, the Peninsular War. Spanish guerrillas, peasants with little formal training, rose against the French occupiers. They struck supply lines, ambushed patrols, and vanished into the hills. It was not the kind of war Napoleon preferred, where vast armies maneuvered on open fields. This was a grinding, merciless struggle, where civilians suffered most. French soldiers faced not only military opposition, but constant hostility from the population. Every village might hide an enemy, every road might conceal an ambush. British forces under the Duke of Wellington soon joined the fight, giving structure and strength to the Spanish resistance. What had seemed like a minor occupation turned into a quagmire. French armies, once thought invincible, bled slowly in the mountains and plains of Iberia. For the first time, the image of Napoleon's invulnerability began to weaken, and beyond Spain, trouble brewed elsewhere. The continental system strained relations with Russia. Tsar Alexander, once Napoleon's uneasy ally at Tilsit, grew restless under the economic restrictions. Russian nobles and merchants resented the blockade, and whispers of defiance reached Napoleon's ears. The alliance between the two emperors, sealed so theatrically on a raft, began to fracture. At the same time, within France itself, life carried on in ways both ordinary and extraordinary. Families adjusted to a reality where fathers, brothers, and sons might be conscripted into endless campaigns. Letters carried news of battles far away, sometimes full of pride, sometimes soaked with grief. Women ran farms and shops in the absence of men. Children grew up with stories of war as their lullabies. To many, the empire felt less like glory and more like an endless drain of energy and life. Yet Napoleon remained confident. His victories had taught him that boldness could overcome difficulty, that persistence could wear down resistance. He believed that with enough effort, Spain would yield, Russia would comply, and Britain would eventually be strangled into submission. But war has a way of punishing certainty. Think for a moment about those Spanish guerrillas, about the fishermen smuggling goods across coasts, about the merchants quietly defying imperial decrees. These were not emperors or kings, yet their actions gnawed at the edges of Napoleon's empire like small cracks spreading through stone. Could it be that the downfall of a man who dominated Europe was not written in grand battles alone, but also in the stubborn refusals of ordinary people? By the year 1812, Napoleon controlled more of Europe than any ruler since the days of Charlemagne. From Spain to Poland, from the Netherlands to Italy, his influence stretched across kingdoms and republics alike. Yet at the heart of his empire's fragility stood one man, Tsar Alexander of Russia. The alliance forged at Tilsit had soured. Russia's economy, strangled by the continental system, groaned under restrictions it could no longer bear. Russian nobles, who depended on trade with Britain, pressured Alexander to abandon Napoleon's policies. By spring, Russia was openly defying the blockade. Napoleon, accustomed to obedience, decided the only solution was force. But Russia was no Austria or Prussia. Its strength was not measured by armies alone, but by sheer vastness. Miles upon miles of land, forests, rivers, and a climate that cared little for imperial ambition. Still, Napoleon believed his Grande Armée, the largest force Europe had ever seen, would succeed where others had failed. More than 600,000 men gathered under his banners. They were not all French. They came from across the empire: Poles, Germans, Italians, Dutch, even reluctant allies from Austria and Prussia. Along with them came wagons, horses, artillery, and supply lines stretched to their limits. On paper, it was unstoppable, but in practice, it was fragile, dependent on order, discipline, and the hope that the enemy would meet them in a decisive battle. When Napoleon crossed the Niemen River in June, the invasion began. But the Russians did not fight as he expected. Instead, they retreated deeper into their own territory, burning fields and villages behind them. The strategy of scorched earth denied Napoleon's army the food and shelter it desperately needed. Soldiers marched hungry, horses starved, and supplies dwindled faster than anyone had anticipated. Finally, in early September, Napoleon got the battle he sought, Borodino. It was one of the bloodiest single days of the Napoleonic Wars. Cannon roared, muskets cracked, and bayonets clashed in brutal close combat. Tens of thousands fell. At the end of the day, the Russians withdrew, but the French were too exhausted to claim true victory. Napoleon stood on the battlefield, surrounded by the dead, knowing he had won nothing decisive. A week later, the French entered Moscow. Napoleon expected the city to surrender, to host him as a conqueror. Instead, fires broke out across the city, destroying much of what might have been useful. Some were accidental, others deliberately set by Russian patriots who would rather burn their capital than let it serve the enemy. Napoleon waited for Alexander to negotiate peace, but no messenger came. Winter loomed, supplies vanished, and the empire's greatest army stood stranded in the ruins of a hostile city. By October, retreat was the only choice. What followed was not simply a military withdrawal, but a catastrophe of human survival. Snow fell, the cold cut through flesh and bone, and frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Soldiers wrapped themselves in rags, ate horseflesh, and scavenged abandoned villages for food. Cossack riders harassed the retreating columns, striking at the weakest and disappearing into the white wilderness. The crossing of the Berezina River in November sealed the tragedy. Bridges collapsed, men drowned, artillery sank into the icy water, and chaos consumed the remnants of the army. From 600,000, only a fraction staggered back across the Niemen. The rest lay buried in the snow, nameless, frozen, and lost. Napoleon himself returned to Paris ahead of the survivors, attempting to frame the disaster as a temporary setback. But Europe had seen the truth. The emperor was not invincible. The myth of endless victory had shattered in the Russian winter. Think for a moment about the soldiers who marched into that endless horizon. Men who had come from farms in Italy, villages in Poland, towns in Germany. They had followed Napoleon with faith in his promise of glory. What went through their minds as the snow deepened and the rations ran out? Did they still see him as a savior, or as a man who had led them into the jaws of death? When Napoleon returned from Russia in the bitter winter of 1812, he was not the same emperor who had once seemed untouchable. Gone were the days when every campaign brought swift victory, when every treaty signed with trembling kings expanded his influence. What limped back across Europe from the Russian snows was not an army, but the shattered skeleton of one. And while Napoleon tried to rebuild, the cracks in his empire widened faster than he could mend them. The disaster in Russia sent a shockwave across the continent. For years, European monarchs had watched Napoleon dominate, grudgingly signing treaties or reluctantly sending soldiers to fight alongside him. Many did so not out of loyalty, but out of fear. Now, with his army reduced to a fraction of its former strength, old enemies began to stir again. Britain, already Napoleon's most relentless opponent, saw an opportunity to encourage new coalitions. Prussia, long humiliated by French dominance, began plotting for revenge. Austria, once crushed by his victories, grew restless. Even within his own empire, murmurs of dissent rose louder. Napoleon, however, was not a man easily defeated by circumstance. In Paris, he worked tirelessly to rebuild his forces. New conscripts were called up, boys barely old enough to shave sent into training to replace the veterans lost in Russia. Weapons were forged, uniforms stitched, and drums beat once again in French villages. His ability to recover from catastrophe was astonishing. Within months, he assembled another formidable army. But what could not be replaced so easily was the experience of the veterans, the seasoned fighters who had marched with him for years. The young men now filling the ranks had enthusiasm but little else, and they would soon be tested in fire. In the spring of 1813, Napoleon marched eastward into Germany. His immediate goal was to force Prussia back into obedience and keep Austria neutral. At first, success seemed possible. In May, he fought the battles of Lutzen and Bautzen, defeating the coalition armies. His troops, though green, responded well under his direct leadership. For a moment, it looked as though the old magic might return. Yet these victories lacked the crushing finality of earlier triumphs. The coalition armies retreated, but they were not destroyed. Then came something new: the armistice. In June, Napoleon agreed to a temporary truce, hoping to buy time to strengthen his forces further. But the pause only allowed his enemies to regroup. Britain poured gold into the coffers of his foes, financing weapons and supplies. Russia and Prussia, once nearly crushed, recovered. Austria, sensing the winds had changed, prepared to join the coalition. By the summer, Napoleon found himself facing a united Europe with Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria aligned against him. The decisive campaign of this struggle unfolded in Saxony around the city of Leipzig. In October of 1813, Napoleon's army clashed with the coalition in what would be remembered as the Battle of Nations. It was the largest battle Europe had seen up to that point, with more than 500,000 soldiers involved over several days. For Napoleon, it was a desperate attempt to hold together his empire. The fighting was brutal and chaotic. Villages burned, cannon thundered, and fields were soaked in blood. Napoleon fought with his usual skill, maneuvering his divisions to strike at weaknesses. For a time, it seemed he might yet win. But as the days wore on, the sheer weight of coalition numbers pressed against him. Worse still, betrayal struck at the heart of his command. Saxon troops, nominally his allies, turned against him during the battle, joining the enemy mid-fight. This act of treachery shattered morale and exposed his forces to overwhelming attacks. On October 18th, Napoleon ordered a retreat. The withdrawal turned into catastrophe when a bridge over the Elster River was blown too early, trapping thousands of French soldiers on the wrong side. Many drowned, others were cut down, and the losses were staggering. By the end of the battle, more than 60,000 of his men lay dead, wounded, or captured. The once mighty Grande Armée was again reduced to tatters. The retreat from Leipzig marked a turning point. Napoleon fell back toward France, hounded by enemies on every side. In Germany, former allies abandoned him, switching allegiance to the coalition. Across the Rhine, kingdoms that had once depended on his favor now looked to protect themselves by siding with his foes. The Napoleonic Empire, so carefully constructed, began to unravel piece by piece. Yet even in retreat, Napoleon displayed remarkable resilience. In early 1814, coalition armies crossed into France itself. For the first time since the Revolution, foreign soldiers threatened French soil. Napoleon, with limited forces, launched a campaign of desperate brilliance known as the 6 Days Campaign. In a series of rapid maneuvers, he struck smaller coalition forces one after another, inflicting defeats that reminded the world why he had risen so high. At Champaubert, Montmirail, Château-Thierry, and Vauchamp, he humbled his enemies with lightning precision. But no matter how brilliant, these victories could not alter the larger truth. The coalition had too many men, too many resources, and too much determination. Each time Napoleon struck down one army, another loomed behind it. Exhaustion spread across his troops. The French countryside, weary after decades of war, offered little enthusiasm. Villages that had once cheered him now groaned at the sight of requisitioning soldiers. Supplies dwindled, and his men grew tired of endless marching and fighting. In March, the coalition armies pushed relentlessly toward Paris. For Napoleon, the capital was everything. To lose it would mean the loss of his legitimacy as emperor. He raced to defend it, but his forces were scattered, and his marshals, worn by years of campaigns, struggled to hold the line. On March 30th, Paris fell. Coalition troops entered the city, while Napoleon, still marching, realized too late that the war was over. Back at Fontainebleau, he faced his marshals and heard their grim advice. They could no longer fight. The empire was lost. For a man who had once commanded Europe, the moment was shattering. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon abdicated. He was sent into exile on the small Mediterranean island of Elba, allowed to retain the title of emperor, but ruling over only a tiny fragment of land. It was a dramatic fall, yet one could argue it was not entirely unexpected. The empire had depended too much on one man, on his brilliance and his will. Without the aura of invincibility, the system he built crumbled. The coalition restored the Bourbon monarchy in France, placing Louis XVIII on the throne. To many, it seemed the Napoleonic era was over. But Napoleon's story was not finished. On Elba, he watched events in Europe closely. Reports reached him of discontent in France. The restored monarchy was unpopular, soldiers longed for their old leader, and many civilians remembered the stability Napoleon had once imposed. Though the wars had been brutal, the emperor had also given France laws, order, and pride. The thought of him still stirred hearts. It is here, in his first exile, that we must pause and reflect. Napoleon had reached the height of power, only to be brought down not by one enemy, but by the combined force of many. He had faced betrayal, overwhelming numbers, and the limits of geography and endurance. Yet his presence still lingered. Europe could exile him, but could it truly rid itself of the man who had reshaped the continent? Consider for a moment those conscripts of 1813, boys pulled from farms and workshops, given muskets and uniforms, and sent to fight battles larger than anything they could imagine. Did they know they were living through the collapse of an era? Did they see Napoleon as a savior fighting for France, or as the cause of endless suffering? Their voices are mostly lost to history, but the weight of their survival, their endurance, or their deaths shaped what followed. Napoleon's empire had cracked, but the man himself was still restless. On Elba, he was not content to fade quietly into history. The next chapter would see him return in one of the most improbable comebacks the world has ever witnessed. But the question remains, if he had truly accepted defeat at this point, how different might Europe's 19th century have been? On the small island of Elba, Napoleon was supposed to fade into obscurity. His empire was gone, his throne occupied by the restored Bourbon king, and Europe had finally breathed a sigh of relief. Yet exile did not suit him. Napoleon was only in his mid-40s, younger than many of the kings and diplomats who had orchestrated his downfall, and his mind still burned with ambition. He busied himself on the island, inspecting roads, reorganizing administration, even planning small improvements to agriculture and trade. But all of it was play acting compared to the empire he had once commanded. Meanwhile, in France, dissatisfaction grew. The Bourbon monarchy, restored under Louis XVIII, seemed out of touch. Many soldiers and officers resented the return of a king who had spent years in exile while they had bled for France. The veterans of Napoleon's wars, men who had marched across Europe and carried the eagle standards into battle, still felt loyalty to their emperor. And ordinary people, though exhausted by war, remembered the stability and order Napoleon's rule had provided. Whispers began to spread. Perhaps the emperor's time was not yet finished. In February of 1815, Napoleon made his move. Slipping away from Elba with a small band of loyal followers, he set sail for France. The gamble was enormous. If captured, he could be executed or imprisoned for life. Yet the plan relied on something simple: the loyalty of the French army. He landed on the coast near Cannes, and with only a few hundred men began marching north. At first, the local authorities panicked, sending troops to arrest him. But here Napoleon's true genius, not only as a commander, but as a figure of legend, revealed itself. When he encountered soldiers sent to stop him, he did not flee or fight. Instead, he stepped forward, opened his coat, and declared, "Here I am. Kill your emperor if you wish." The gamble worked. The soldiers, instead of firing, rallied to him. What began as a march with a few hundred men swelled into thousands as regiment after regiment defected to his side. News raced ahead of him, and in Paris the Bourbon monarchy trembled. By the time Napoleon entered the capital in March, Louis XVIII had already fled. The emperor had returned, and the world was stunned. This extraordinary comeback is remembered as the 100 Days, the brief period between his return to power and his final defeat. For Napoleon, it was both a chance at redemption and the last desperate throw of the dice. Europe reacted swiftly. The great powers, Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, gathered once more, declaring Napoleon an outlaw and preparing armies to crush him. They would not make the same mistake twice. This time they were determined to end his rule permanently. Napoleon, for his part, moved quickly to consolidate power. He promised a more liberal constitution, attempting to win over moderates who had grown weary of absolutism. He also appealed to nationalist pride, presenting himself as the defender of France against foreign kings who sought to dictate its future. Yet time was not on his side. He had only weeks to prepare before the coalition armies closed in. His strategy was to strike swiftly before the enemy could fully unite. In June of 1815, he marched into Belgium to confront the British and Prussian forces before the Austrians and Russians could arrive. The stage was set for one of history's most famous battles, Waterloo. On June 18th, near the village of Waterloo, Napoleon faced the Duke of Wellington's Anglo-Allied army. The battlefield was muddy from heavy rain, slowing movements and making artillery less effective. Still, Napoleon believed in his ability to break the enemy lines. Early in the day, he launched attacks against Wellington's forces, focusing on key strongpoints like Hougoumont Farm and La Haye-Sainte. The fighting was fierce, with French columns advancing repeatedly under heavy fire, but Wellington held firm. His troops dug in behind ridges and defended positions, absorbed the assaults with grim determination. Napoleon waited too long to unleash his reserves, hoping for the arrival of Marshal Grouchy's corps to hold off the Prussians. Yet Grouchy, delayed and misled, never arrived in time. Instead, it was the Prussian army under Blücher that appeared on the field, crashing into Napoleon's flank in the late afternoon. Even then, the battle was not yet lost. Napoleon committed his Imperial Guard, his most elite troops, the men who had never broken in battle. They marched forward with discipline and pride, the last hope of the Empire. But as they advanced, they were met with devastating volleys of musket fire. The guard faltered, then broke. Panic spread, and the French army collapsed into retreat. For the first time, Napoleon's most trusted soldiers had failed him. The defeat at Waterloo was absolute. Napoleon fled the battlefield, his dreams shattered. Within days, Paris was again in enemy hands. This time, there would be no Elba, no small island close to Europe where he could plot a return. The British, determined to prevent another escape, sent him into exile on the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, thousands of miles from France. On St. Helena, guarded by British soldiers and cut off from the world, Napoleon spent the last 6 years of his life. He dictated his memoirs, reflecting on his career, his battles, and his vision for Europe. He painted himself as a man of destiny, misunderstood and betrayed, but also as a lawgiver who had brought stability to France after revolution. To some, he was a tyrant who had drowned Europe in blood. To others, he was a genius who had challenged the old order and reshaped history. He died there in May of 1821, only 51 years old. Even in death, his shadow lingered. His body was eventually returned to France in 1840, reinterred in Paris under a grand tomb, a monument to a man whose legacy refused to fade. Pause for a moment and imagine those 100 days, the march from Cannes to Paris, the cheers of soldiers, the fear in royal palaces, the clash of nations at Waterloo. What must it have felt like to witness a man once thought finished rise again, only to fall once more, this time forever? Was it madness that drove Napoleon to risk everything, or was it the inevitable destiny of a man who could not live without power? Napoleon Bonaparte's death on St. Helena in May of 1821 marked the end of a life defined by ambition, brilliance, and the relentless pursuit of power. Yet to reduce him to merely a conqueror or a despot would be to overlook the profound and lasting effects he had on France, Europe, and even the wider world. His life, from the rocky coasts of Corsica to the frozen fields of Russia, was more than a sequence of battles and political maneuvers. It was an experiment in what one man could achieve, how one mind could reshape societies, laws, and the lives of millions. Even in exile, Napoleon understood the power of narrative. He spent his days dictating memoirs and reflecting on the meaning of his career. He sought to control the story of his life, emphasizing his role as a savior of France. a man who had brought order after revolution, a lawgiver as much as a warrior. He framed his failures not as incompetence, but as the unavoidable result of circumstance, betrayal by allies, overwhelming numbers of enemies, and the unforgiving forces of nature. Yet beneath these justifications lies a deeper truth about human ambition, that even the most capable leaders are limited by time, geography, and the endurance of those around them. Napoleon's legacy is most enduring in the institutions he created. The Napoleonic Code, first enacted in 1810, reshaped the legal landscape not only in France, but across the continent. It codified principles of equality before the law, the secular authority of the state, and protection of property rights. For ordinary citizens, this meant predictability in everyday life. A farmer in Normandy, a merchant in Lyon, or a craftsman in Marseille could now rely on a single coherent legal system rather than a patchwork of local customs and revolutionary decrees. The code also spread to territories he conquered, from Italy to the Netherlands, leaving a lasting imprint on European law that remains visible even today. Education was another pillar of his reforms. Napoleon established lycées, specialized schools designed to train administrators, engineers, and officers loyal to the state. These schools created pathways for social mobility previously unavailable in France. Sons of modest families could rise through talent and discipline, learning skills that allowed them to serve their country effectively. Education, like law, became a tool for building a modern nation, reflecting Napoleon's belief that governance required not only force, but knowledge. Economically, Napoleon attempted to stabilize France after decades of turmoil. He reformed taxation, reorganized the administration, and encouraged industry and infrastructure. Roads were built, canals dug, and ports modernized, providing the framework for a functioning economy. Even as he pursued wars abroad, he recognized that the strength of his empire depended on the prosperity of ordinary people at home. The balance between war and domestic administration was delicate, yet he understood that a state could not function on glory alone. Yet Napoleon's genius was inseparable from his flaws. His ambition led to nearly constant warfare, which claimed millions of lives across Europe. Soldiers from France, Italy, Germany, Poland, and beyond marched and bled under his command, many never to return home. Civilians, too, bore the cost. Towns were requisitioned, villages plundered, and economies strained to support armies marching across continents. The spread of nationalism that he inspired sometimes came as a double-edged sword. While some populations embraced new ideas of equality and governance, others experienced oppression and forced conscription. History remembers him both for the stability he brought and the devastation he caused. Napoleon's relationship with power offers lessons about leadership and human psychology. He combined strategic brilliance with the ability to inspire loyalty. Soldiers followed him not merely because of orders, but because they believed in his vision. Ordinary citizens trusted him to restore order, even after decades of revolution. Yet this centralization of authority also made his empire fragile. When his forces were decimated in Russia, when alliances fractured, or when betrayal struck in Saxony and Spain, the absence of a resilient, decentralized system meant the empire crumbled rapidly. The lesson is stark. One person can shape history, but no one is invincible, and no system should depend entirely on a single mind. Consider also the personal dimension of his life. Napoleon's story is one of resilience and ambition, but also isolation. Even at the height of his power, he faced distrust, envy, and plots from those closest to him. His relationships, whether with Josephine, his family, or his marshals, were often complicated by political necessity. Decisions were rarely purely personal. They were calculated to reinforce authority, secure loyalty, or advance his vision. In the quiet moments on Elba or St. Helena, he confronted the cost of this ambition, a life of extraordinary influence, yet ultimately isolated from the world he had sought to dominate. Napoleon's impact on Europe extended far beyond the immediate political and military sphere. His conquests spread ideas born of the French Revolution, legal equality, meritocracy, and secular governance. Even as he imposed his authority, he carried forward the notion that society could be reorganized based on rational principles rather than tradition alone. In Italy, the Netherlands, Germany, and Poland, these reforms planted seeds that would grow long after his armies withdrew. Though often overshadowed by the devastation of war, these institutional changes constitute a lasting part of his legacy. Equally important was the way Napoleon changed the perception of leadership. He demonstrated that a single individual could alter the fate of nations through vision, decisiveness, and relentless energy. He combined intellect with intuition, daring with discipline. Yet his life also illustrates the dangers of overreach. By stretching his empire too far, by underestimating logistics, climate, and the will of people, he exposed the limits of even the most extraordinary genius. Leadership, as his career shows, is a delicate balance between ambition and prudence, between vision and the practical constraints of the world. Even his exile on St. Helena has lessons about human endurance. Cut off from power, surrounded by isolation, he adapted to a life of observation, reflection, and writing. He engaged with scholars, chronicled history, and attempted to frame his narrative. These years reveal the human capacity to find purpose even when the world seems to have ended. While he could no longer lead armies, he could still think, analyze, and influence memory, an empire of ideas replacing the empire of armies. For ordinary people in France and across Europe, Napoleon remains a complex figure. For some, he is a tyrant who imposed wars and drained resources. For others, he is a lawgiver, reformer, and symbol of national pride. Both perspectives are true. History is rarely simple, and his life demonstrates that greatness and destruction often coexist in the same individual. The lessons lie in understanding both the brilliance and the cost, in recognizing that ambition reshapes the world but never comes without consequences. Even today, his story resonates. Governments study his strategies, militaries analyze his campaigns, and legal scholars examine the enduring influence of the Napoleonic Code. Towns and battlefields that witnessed his triumphs and defeats remain places of pilgrimage, reminding us of the scale of human endeavor and the fragile balance between genius and disaster. Napoleon's life, in its grandeur and tragedy, continues to inspire reflection on ambition, power, and resilience. Finally, consider the ordinary people behind his story. Soldiers who marched through mud and snow, civilians caught between armies, children growing up in wartime Europe. Their endurance, sacrifice, and sometimes resistance were the true foundation of his empire. Without their labor, loyalty, and suffering, even a man of genius could have accomplished little. History is not written by emperors alone. It is the cumulative effect of countless lives intersecting with extraordinary events. Napoleon's life reminds us that human resilience and ambition are inseparable, and that history is shaped as much by ordinary lives as by the extraordinary. Napoleon Bonaparte's life, from the rocky shores of Corsica to the lonely winds of St. Helena, spans the extremes of human achievement and failure. His brilliance reshaped France and Europe, yet it also brought devastation and suffering. His reforms endure, his military campaigns are studied, and his legend continues to captivate the imagination. In the end, He was a man of paradox, a lawgiver and a warrior, a savior and a conqueror, a genius and a cautionary tale. As we reflect on his legacy, one question remains. How much of history is shaped by individuals, and how much by the countless unseen lives that enable or resist them? In Napoleon's story, the answer is clear. Neither genius nor ambition acts alone. It is the interplay between extraordinary vision and ordinary endurance, between ambition and circumstance, that determines the fate of nations. History does not forget, and in the story of Napoleon Bonaparte, we see both the heights humanity can reach and the depths it can endure. It is a story of ambition, resilience, and the complex consequences of human action, a story that continues to echo across centuries, reminding us that the past, in all its nuance, still shapes our present.